just open up the discussion, and we have a half hour plus 2 minutes, so Annette. And I'll gather, okay?
Thank you very much. It was really, the three of you, very fascinating. And my question is about degenerate art, to try to link Germany and Italy, as you did. To my knowledge, and also a bit of information, it will open a big exhibit in Paris in the Picasso Museum about degenerate art, the exhibit of 37 and the others. So it should be quite interesting, and with a lot of big catalog and a lot of scientific things around. There is absolutely no futurist art. I can understand that the two countries are allies, but I would like to ask you the question, why not? There were, to my knowledge, very few futurist art both in Germany before 33 or even around. But futurist art was both in other European countries, and when they sold the degenerate art to nice Swiss and nice French and nice Belgium, we were very happy to buy them. There was no futurist art ever, so I would like to know about it. And if there was, why it's never mentioned, and it's not mentioned in your shows, and obviously in the one that everybody should go and see, to see by themselves that the depolitization and the no pathos is very vivid today in Meloni's Italia.
Thank you, Raffaele and Lou and Ofer. This was just a really, really fascinating panel. I have a question for Raffaele, and it comes from just sheer ignorance of the Italian sort of art scene. And I'm just wondering, in any of the exhibitions or in the sort of survey that you've considered, were there exiled artists? And if so, how were their works produced in exile discussed, folded in? I mean, this is such a huge issue in the German context. I'm just curious how it is in the Italian.
Okay, we'll take 2 more and then, yes.
I need to press it? Or is it pressed? Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Aristotle Kallis. Fascinating. I'm going to start with it's not a long thing. I'm just going to contextualize my question with a 20-second beginning. I was in India, and I went in Chandigarh, and I went to an exhibition, and it was an exhibition on Le Corbusier, and inside it was a whole room on Casa del Fascio by Giuseppe Terragni, who is one of the most fascist dedicated architects. And I was really interested in that. There was no mention of this, and the only mention about Terragni was the fact that he was a modernist who went to Siam conferences, and he was part of this new wave of architecture afterwards. My question is, and I'm a historian and not a curator, so I'm asking to learn. A curator makes connections and choices, okay? When we have competing narratives like this one, or to flip it, in a competing narrative of Mies van der Rohe, who is presented as a modernist, but let's not forget, in 33 and 34, he submitted plans for an architectural competition under the Nazi regime. How do we make the decision that one kind of narrative is legitimate and therefore can be part of the exhibition as contextualization, while the other one isn't? What is the criterion? And I'm genuinely interested in hearing your opinions.
I think my question follows directly on from that, even without having been to India. And it picks up on Ofer's wonderful response, because I felt in the first thing you raised the central question, which is there a clear fascist aesthetic, and then you gave it away a bit, because I think the second thing was much more about how you disrupt it by looking at different vantage points, but it wasn't necessarily about aesthetics. And I do think this is, I mean, Hans-Dieter Schäfer years ago in the book Das gespaltene Bewusstsein already talked about the way there was a move in German aesthetics before the Nazis away from 1920 style. So in that sense, they were in the trend. And of course, one can also talk about the way that Goebbels was in some ways quite open to other modernist aspects. I would just add, I worked on a resistance group that were very much into dance and movement, and I found it extremely difficult to decide if their approach was really that different from the Nazis that they felt so opposed to. I tried to claim that there was, but I'm not sure that I was right. So I don't want, in other words, I would like that question that you posed to hang in the room. I feel like this is a real issue that confronts us. So I'm really just echoing what Aristotle just said.
And you can also respond.
Yeah, I think that one point that somehow connects a number of the questions goes back to Professor Roberts' second question, namely the difference between the fascist policy towards art and Nazi and why of the difference, right? Why there's no degenerate art show in Italy and what that meant afterwards. And I think that there are at least three elements, 3 points to be made on this. The first one is the strategy, right? That the fascist regime had, how the fascist regime used art. There was a systematic and deliberate choice made by the Italian fascist regime to create a pretty loose parameters for our practice. As I was mentioning, there is respect for the aesthetic autonomy of the artist, and this was used to, one, promote fascism abroad. So in cultural diplomacy, the regime deliberately chose exhibitions depending on the interlocutor. So exhibitions organized in the United States in the 1930s, they would include as many Jews as possible. They would include women. They would show a number of stylistic trends in order to demonstrate that fascism had revived Italian creativity, had modernized Italy. It was something that started more strongly, especially after the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, to show that fascism was going back to the tradition of Italy as a source of civilization, the civilizing mission, the eternal genius of the Italians, right? So in the responses, for example, towards the German policy in art, Mussolini would call the Germans barbarians. They don't know what art is about, the importance of art. This brings to the second point. Art, and here we're talking about fine art. There is a specificity to the way works of art function and the way they were utilized to build a national identity in Italy. The Venice Biennale was founded in the 1880s, and right after Italy was unified, and part of the Risorgimento already there was this idea that when Italy was unified, there was no common language, there was no common history. Italy had been fragmented, dominated by various rules with different cultures, but there was a history of art that could unify Italy, right? The fact that Antonello da Messina worked from Sicily to Venice, Nicola Pisano from Puglia to Liguria, right? This idea that there was an Italian art before Italy existed as a political entity. And that was very much in its infancy when fascism took power, and the fascist regime developed that notion in a very powerful way. There was a structure, a system of exhibitions in Italy for the first time that never happened again. There was a system of the mostre sindacali. Basically, artists, if they were part of the union of fascist artists, they could participate in the exhibition at the local level. If they were successful, they would participate at the regional level. If the best of them would go to the Quadriennale in Rome, and finally the top would reach the Venice Biennale and therefore be presented internationally, right? So there was a system in which basically two messages were conveyed. One, if art is very important, art to be Italian and to have a vibrant, complex art production is integral part of being an Italian. The second thing was that this has it cannot be compared to the rest of the world. In cultural diplomacy, this meant that, for example, in the United States, there was a big interest in Renaissance show. In the 1930s, museums would ask for Botticelli and Michelangelo, and there was always this trade. Okay, we are gonna send you the, Uffizi masterpieces, but you are going to show also the contemporary art artworks. The flip side, the other component of this was that it created a culture of complacency. Artists would participate in the construction of the rhetoric regardless of their choice. So those loose parameters had only one rule: as long as you don't attack the regime, as long as you don't criticize the regime, then your art is fine. You can be a futurist, then there is a very expansive system of patronage, state patronage. So all the various groups and tendencies would receive commissions. Of course, the most, like Sironi would have a big fresco in Sapienza and in the main spots in Milan and in Rome. The futurists would have, the post office in Palermo, which is still very important, but it created a whole network, right, of participation. After the war, and this goes then to Ofer's question, right, about what is a fascist aesthetic, it created a whole a big ambivalence in how the aesthetic worked. I'm just going to make an example. Morandi, Giorgio Morandi. He was a painter who just did still lifes, just bottles, okay? Right after the war, he became this kind of huge hero. In 1948, he got a prize at the Biennale, at the Quadriennale. He was considered kind of private resistant. And this goes back to the idea of the good Italian. The idea that Morandi did not participate in the rhetoric of the regime. He just withdrew. He was in his house, painting obsessively little bottles, right? And abstracting them. In the post-war, he was widely beloved. Anyway. Only in the 1990s did a scholar, Emily Brown, wrote an article pointing out that actually that visual, the aesthetics and the history of Morandi actually emerged out of Strapaese. Strapaese was a movement in the 1930s and was part of what Gentile saw as the anti-modernist component of futurism. It was the idea of the good old rural life, the old-fashioned lifestyle of the countryside. Those dusty bottles actually represent something very important about the Italian identity and the fascist identity. This didn't change at all the reception of Morandi, and this goes back to one of the recurring questions, namely the market for Morandi, the exhibitions of Morandi, are not comparable to the private photographs that were kept and can be presented critically, but still there is a currency, there is a weight that needs to be considered in its specificity. And so my question was more about what do we do with those objects that are part of very important collections in major art museums that are worth millions, right? And are still there, and they were integral part in the construction of consensus. They were integral part in the idea of a national identity that is strongly intertwined with fascist ideology. But it's still there, right? And so the reiteration of those exhibitions somehow make that question, put that question, silence that question, and that's the kind of issue that I wanted to raise.
Okay, so that's pretty.
Yeah.
No response to that.
Just to answer Mark's comment, yes, of course, yeah, it's true. I dropped it for two reasons. One is that in this context of what to do with exhibitions, I think one of the points is that if this aesthetics is neutral in a way, it gives us a lot of space to ask questions about the mechanism that makes it part of building consensus, right? So actually it opens the way to many other questions, and we don't bother with the question of this is so, so fascist because we see the male body at work and stuff like that. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, Raffaele, Roberta Perger. Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really fascinating, the way in which people with different goals for exhibitions and coming also from different political backgrounds all ended up performing sort of the same decoupling of art and politics, right? And so what it made me wonder is whether there isn't maybe, just we've been talking about genealogies today, a longer term way in which art is perceived in Italy, so that what happens with fascist art, or art during fascism, and its exhibition in the post-fascist period, curators are thinking in terms of the work of art and what happens with the work of art, and even if they're anti-fascist, the political context just gets bracketed because that's what we do. And so in other words, us historians getting upset about yet another exhibition that does not pay attention to the political context actually belongs to a long tradition of operating just in that way. And that is something that I had not been aware of, even though it maps onto some other tendencies in looking at the fascist past. But I do think it also speaks to something different, and that is the place and positioning of art that tends to put it on a different plane, even when it is absolutely enmeshed with its political messaging. And I was hoping that my common question might give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the most recent exhibitions that you were not able to address in your talk.
Can you just respond to that?
Oh, okay.
So I just want to make sure this is clear. You're saying that the aestheticization of art is pretty much a tradition, so that you can't really interpret it as a form of erasure, as Bedarida did, because its aestheticization of art is not peculiar to the post-war period.
Well, I guess what the realization I had as I was listening to Raffaele is that it's not so much a pseudo-fascist, proto-fascist, post-fascist operation that we are seeing in these exhibitions, but it is some other kind of artistic celebration that ends up doing just that, but doesn't start from that premise. Do you see what I'm saying? So if we look at it, we are seeing some sort of inability to come to terms with the past, maybe we're even seeing a celebration of some fascist aesthetic, but I think the curators are not necessarily starting from that premise. They do not want to revive fascism in any way, or celebrate fascism, or be anti-fascist or something of that sort. But they make that choice explicitly so of doing this kind of operation that has these results.
Okay, now we suddenly have lots of Pamela and Alyssa and Nakwa and Manu.
Okay, thank you, Pam Ballinger. I just want to add to what Roberta's saying. So, I mean, coming from a discipline like anthropology, right, there's this well-known book, Primitive Art in Civilized Places, which talks about how, depending upon the disciplinary perspective, right, the aestheticization of that lays out the ethnographic context. And I was wondering also about the status of Italian art history, because having studied in Florence like every other American in the 1980s, right, I remember our art history classes when we went, it was a very formalist approach, right, that our Italian professor engaged in, and, you know, it was quite different from what was maybe more prominent in the US at the time about like talking about patronage and the context and, you know, Foucault in relation to, I'm sure that's all changed, but I'm wondering about the disciplinary aspect of Italian art, which I think goes to what Roberta's asking about, the focus on the formalistic, formal aspects of the aesthetics. And then maybe if you see change over time from that point of view in terms of the different exhibitions that you discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like, Elisa Marenda, I would like to also draw up on what Roberta said, because when I listened, I was reminded in Paris 2 years ago, there was a first exhibit, a big exhibit at the Centre Pompidou of Neue Sachlichkeit. And it was, and I think it just reminded me all these fascist exhibitions on not fascist, on futurist art that you discussed, because I think, and I joined Roberta, maybe why do we always need to have this separation of a good art and a bad one? And so this Neue Sachlichkeit, for instance, of course it's fabulous, but certain artwork, certain songs, I mean, it can also be anti-Semitic, it can also be so it's not, Neue Sachlichkeit is not this holy place where everything is good, and so maybe this is this tradition of curating and of wanting to, maybe also historians want to do, to really seize like a movement and a moment, and to represent them, maybe not only the good sides, but actually it ends up to something good. And it's always puzzling me, because I actually don't do feel good history, but I know a lot of people expect, and now I have a big troubles with students, because most of them have seen a lot of series on Weimar Republic and this show, and it's very difficult to tell them, well, the Weimar Republic is also a lot of things. It's also very conservative, and it's also I mean, that all this work, and Detlef Peukert, for instance, we haven't mentioned him, but he did a really great work of really showing that there's not only a tradition, but there are really direct ways to go to Nazism. And so, and just to offer, I really like this agency of this Jewish Gegenblick or counter, and I wanted, this is such so, would it also work for Germans? I mean, of course, if I, as a German non-Jewish person, put my child in front of this, it has a total different meaning, but actually it also shows that there are so many registers, small, to resist, to be critical. And I study more the German albums, and I don't see that. So actually it's really like people buying into this ideology, into this regime, into this in their everyday life. And I know, Louise, you really always say power relations are key, and I also think so this power, I mean, the non-Jewish Germans would have had so many possibilities to make a difference, to be small, to have small critical captions, gestures, but they didn't. Most of them, almost most of them did not.
Okay. I don't know if Raffaele was asking the question rhetorically, how does one curate to evoke critical questions, or whether you were asking sincerely for advice and suggestions. Okay, I don't know, but I was incredibly glad that Lou brought up the story of the early 1970s when finally that Nazi art came back, and they finally put in, Georg Bussmann did the book. You should look at it, Kunst im Dritten Reich. I don't know if you've seen it. It's so good that you brought that up, because the leftist youngsters who curated that exhibit in 1973 so distrusted the German public that every single piece of Nazi art was juxtaposed with a photograph of Nazi crimes. Okay, every single thing. You have Jewish women lined up about to be slaughtered beside the Nazi nudes. It's totally intense. You have people working in a munitions factory beside, you know, the heroic labor stuff and so on. So that kind of contrast is very didactic, but I think it's extremely interesting. It's worth looking at. Then I have two other examples. One is called Serving Racial Politics. I can give you the reference. I just wrote it down for you. But it was a topography of terror several years ago, in 2017. And they took Anna Koppitz. She's one of the most famous of the Nazi photographers. She worked for Walter Darré. And what they did there, they have all the gorgeous bodies, but they have the correspondence between the photographers complaining that they can't find perfect specimens. And there's debates about whether to lighten the areolas, the nipples on the female nudes and so on. Like they're really whining about the, you know, concave chests of the boys and all this stuff. It's just really amazing. So I think that I keep on making this point, but it seems to get hard to get it across. The master race is not naturally perfect. And that exhibit communicated that beautifully. And then the final exhibit I want to call to everyone's attention is Bürle, who was a weapons salesman in Zurich. And there's an amazing exhibit now called A Future for the Past about the Bürle collection, which I highly recommend, where he basically purchased art, but it was stolen from Jews. But he's buying it on the, quote, open market, although it's not an open market, because, you know. And then he gives a lot of money. So he's a philanthropist. He's an arms merchant in the decolonization era. He gives money. He sells weapons to decolonizing resistance fighters and to repressive forces. He makes unbelievable amounts of money. He turns it all into art. And the way they've handled it now is that they show you all the art. They raise the questions about who does it belong to. Does it belong to the original Jews or not? But they also have invited people of all colors, experts, to weigh in the present about what to do about it and how to feel about it. And so they've just posed the questions as part of the exhibit, and they've posed the relationship between present and past as part of the exhibit.
I will try to be brief, and I will follow up to what Roberta said, and I will enlarge it. After 2 days of discussion, and since that we are just comparing all the time, what is good and what is bad, and then we said, as Raffaele showed, lots of also artists, Jewish artists, not only Carlo Levi. We have a long list. We can talk about Italian cinema 1933, apropos, and we talk about Vittorio Mussolini that open up these things. And we have authors like Rossellini, Antonioni, Visconti, that after the war, they will become exactly as an example of anti-fascism. Now, I don't know if Roberta meant that in looking at the exhibition, but what they will say about us, resting in this discussion about fascism, how is, in a sense, the betrayal of the intellectuals in living in a moment, in historical moments, when we have a kind of responsibility and a judgment to be made, because, as we say in Israel in the last, I think, 2 years, we will be judged by history. So, and I was wondering if in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, I don't know if they will talk about us, but what they will say about fascism. Because it's true that fascism and Nazism are profoundly different. And he's opened up Mosse when he says, we have to talk about Nazism and to see how close he is to fascism. Because it bothers me. No, this kind of things that the myths of the Italian, the good Italian, that it started not in Italy, but in the occupation of the Italian army. They are the soldiers. They are not the Italian population. That they helped the Jews against the partisans, for example. So you would say that they were good guys or bad guys. It depends who is the subject that is receiving the attack. It's not something that we can really dismiss when we talk about this kind of, it's true, Carlo Levi said, don't arrest me, but he was sent to exile. He was not sent to a concentration camps. He was not gassed. That's the thing that we should remember. What happened with the racist policy? Not to say that Italian was a good, it depends, no? Mason says the special trials, they were bad. But the Italian writing that Cesare Pavese described as a kind of Alexandrine culture, a culture of involvement, a kind of cooperation. Shituf Paula, how do you say that? Badly.
One exhibit on the history of the Documenta at the Deutsches Historisches Museum, which problematized the National Socialist and actually SS lineage of the organizer of Werner Hanfmann, who was then became for many, many years the director of the Neue Nationalgalerie and was apparently directly involved in the arrest of Rudolf Levi. And he was the one chosen to direct this Cold War celebration of West German democracy, Documenta, in 1955. So there's a long history of not suppressing that, of actually doing something very similar to what Raffaele was talking about. However, there it's really more about the curators and the organizers, half of whom were members of the Nazi Party, of that Documenta. So maybe we need to put that exhibit into the mix. And there's lots of literature about that. Okay, we have, do you want to just take one more moment? And
I have a vertigo moment like that. But now, one thing. So there was a question about were there exile artists, and that's something that allows me to say something. Yes, there were exile artists who were included in the exhibitions. All of them, actually. I'm familiar with the work of Corrado Cagli, and I've worked on this artist. He was a Jewish openly gay artist who had a successful career in Rome, and with public commissions from the fascist government, did frescoes, did major work, and then as a Jew had to leave Italy in 1938. Moved to the United States, and started doing work in which he took distance, right? He started to deconstruct, introduce irony into the very rhetoric he had, helped build. Finally, he fought in the war as a US soldier. He participated in the liberation of Buchenwald and produced drawings on this. MoMA, Radianti, Barilli, Celant, they all included works by Cagli for stylistic reasons, right? So it's as part of a post-Cubist moment in Italian abstraction after the war. So I've tried to curate a show in which those drawings actually start to speak to the public and take so in this kind of trajectory, it's possible, right, to do that, and that goes to the question about how the field has changed. I think that the studies of exhibition history have made a big difference. That's also why I'm doing it, namely focusing not on what happens in the artist studio and what is the intentionality of the artist, what is the quality, going back to Roberta's comment, the intrinsic quality. People, would talk about that in our history as the prime criterion. Not that, but rather the system that make art accessible to the public, and the discursive component of entering the public space with an exhibition as something that is made by multiple voices. So that I think gives the exhibition an angle, and a transnational one, right? So exhibitions travel, the way meaning is constructed differently depending on where they are done, and that's something very important.
Thank you very much.